Thank you so much. So, like the title of the presentation explains, today we're going to be talking mainly about prediabetes and type 2 diabetes and how you can reverse them using a plant-based diet. So we can go into a lot of nuanced details about exactly what causes prediabetes and type 2 diabetes and what you can do using your diet plus also your lifestyle to significantly improve your overall health and then have your A1C value come down significantly into the non-diabetic range. So I think some of you might have been there when Robbie was giving a presentation specifically about what foods you can eat to maximize your insulin sensitivity, aka reverse insulin resistance. And I'll be touching on those some similar concepts today, but I'm going to go into the sort of deep biological mechanism of insulin resistance, which is the underlying cause of high blood glucose. So I'll start with that, and then we can progress into a little bit more detailed information. So as you can see, here's what we're going to cover today. The first thing we're going to talk about is what are the dietary causes of insulin resistance. I'll teach you what the biological mechanism of insulin resistance actually is. And then I'll teach you also how to stabilize your insulin sensitivity or how to maximize your insulin sensitivity using a low-fat plant-based whole food lifestyle. Let's be active in the chat box actually as we're going through this whole thing today. Before I get into the actual biological mechanism, what I want to know from you guys is what do you know about insulin resistance? If you think you know what the actual cause of insulin resistance is, please write it into the chat box. Feel free to just put your thoughts in there. I can see the chat box here, so I'll be able to see those as we go through the presentation. But my question for you is, what have you learned? What has the internet taught you? What have books taught you? What has your doctor taught you that actually causes insulin resistance? Okay, and be very specific. So Lisa says fat. Okay, Laura says too much fat in the diet. Cheryl says fats in cells. BH says fat in the organs and muscles. So you guys are all moving in the right direction, no question. Okay. For the longest time, we've been told that it's all about sugar. Okay. That the cause of insulin resistance is actually eating a high sugar diet, aka a high carbohydrate diet. And as a result of that, you're forcing your pancreas to have to work too hard. Okay. Nita says, my body is unable to use the insulin I make. Okay. That's actually technically speaking, the most accurate description thus far. No question. Nice work, Nita. Patrick says too much glucose production by the pancreas. Okay. So the pancreas does not produce glucose. The pancreas produces insulin, but you're on the right track, Patrick. And then Jessica says fat and sugar combined. And that is also technically speaking a correct answer. So I think that you guys have most of the mechanics down. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through the actual mechanism from start to finish. And then that way, when you guys walk away from this, you'll be insulin resistance experts. Okay. Before we get there, I'll just give you my brief backstory. Okay. I was diagnosed with not one, not two, but three autoimmune conditions when I was a senior in college. So the year 2002, I was trying to graduate, and my doctors told me that I got diagnosed with three conditions. Number one, Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. Number two, alopecia universalis, which is basically just scientific code for you will lose your hair. And that's why, as you can see in the photo here, I have no hair, no eyebrows, no eyelashes, no nose hair, no ear hair, no beard, nothing. I used to have hair, but it disappeared. And then I got type 1 diabetes. So three autoimmune conditions within a 6-month period. And I had no idea what was the reason for any of that. My doctors also could not explain the cause of those three, but they did tell me, they said, listen, if you just eat a low carbohydrate diet, then at least you can prevent your glucose from going high and you can probably control your insulin use. So why don't you do that? And I said, okay, great. Sounds like a plan. So they told me to eat foods you see on the screen. Okay. Dairy products, butter, eggs, bacon, red meat, white meat, fish, turkey burgers, peanut butter. Okay. High fat, high protein foods, and to limit fruits and potatoes and rice and bread and legumes. I said, eat these foods. And when you eat these foods, it doesn't really cause insulin to be secreted, and then you'll be fine. Just keep your insulin use low. So I said, okay, great. Thank you for the information. The problem was that when I implemented the plan that they had described, it did not work. Not only was my blood glucose a disaster, not only was I on the blood glucose roller coaster all day, every day, with glucose ranging anywhere from like 40, which is quite hypoglycemic, all the way up to 400, which is very hyperglycemic. But I also suffered from very low energy. I became anxious. I became depressed. I started to go talk to a therapist. My blood glucose meter just felt like it was kind of spitting out a bunch of random numbers and I had no control over it. And my muscles hurt, my joints hurt, and I just felt like I was going further and further and further down into a path of no return. So at about the year marker, I opened my mind to changing the way that I was eating because clearly that method didn't seem to be doing me any good. And a friend of mine said, "Hey, you ever thought about eating a plant-based diet?" And I was like, "Nope." He said, "Maybe you should open your mind to it." And I said, "Cool, sounds like a plan. What do I do?" So I ended up switching over to eating a plant-based diet, and I did it cold turkey. This was back in 2003, and I did it under the supervision of a gentleman named Dr. Doug Graham. So he taught me how to eat a raw food diet. And the raw food diet, I'm just eating a bunch of fruits and vegetables. That's literally all I ate. And I was worried that by eating the foods you see on the screen, lots of colorful papayas and mangoes and bananas, and so similar to the fruits that Robbie had talked about the other day, dates and oranges and apples and pears, and then also uncooked vegetables as well, that my glucose was going to go through the roof. So I was nervous that I was going to have to take more insulin, and then I was nervous that my glucose would go very high. But what you can see here is from a macronutrient perspective, my fat intake went down significantly. So the red line represents how much fat I was consuming. So the red line started at about 80-ish grams of fat per day. And within the first week, I dropped it down to about 30 grams of fat. And then I continued to drop a little bit more. So I was down in the low 20s or so by the time I hit week 3. And my carbohydrate intake went up significantly. It started about 100 grams per day. And then by the time I was done with week 1, I was at 500 and then eventually up to 600 grams of carbohydrate per day. So I was effectively trading fuels. I was eating more carbohydrate for less fat. And again, I was worried. I said, wait a minute, if I eat this much carbohydrate, my doctors told me that I will need more insulin. My doctors told me that my glucose would go high. So I am nervous. But Doug said, Cyrus, it's a story. Don't worry about it. So despite my fear, this is what happened to my insulin use. My insulin use started about 42 units per day. And then by the end of week 1, I was down to about 32 units. And by the end of week 2, I was down to about 26 units. And then by the end of week 3, I was down to about 23 units per day. Okay, so this is basically a 43% reduction in a 3-week period, which for a person with type 1 diabetes is a massive, massive reduction in insulin use. But the kicker was that I wasn't just using less insulin because I was subtracting carbohydrate energy. I was using less insulin, and my carbohydrate intake had gone from about 100 grams north of 600. So I 6x'd my carbohydrate intake. I ate 6 times the amount of carbohydrate, and my insulin use fell by 43%. So something interesting was happening here. This was exactly opposite to what the doctors had told me. It's opposite to what the textbooks had said. It's opposite to the traditional wisdom of diabetes blood glucose control was. And I was like, this is fascinating. Not only was my glucose more controlled, but I felt way more energy, more hydrated. I could sleep better. Anxiety disappeared. Depression went away. I could exercise more. My muscles didn't hurt. I felt like a completely newborn individual. It felt fantastic. So fast forward another couple of years, I was eating this way. I felt fantastic. And I said, you know what? I kind of want to learn some science about this. So I applied to PhD programs, and I ended up going to UC Berkeley for 5 years. And while I was there, I was able to investigate everything there is to know about blood glucose control. And I did a deep dive into the mechanism of insulin resistance, because it is the thing that causes erratic blood glucose in people like me living with type 1, but it's also the thing that causes erratic blood glucose in people who are living with prediabetes and type 2. In fact, it's the thing that unites all forms of diabetes, whether it's type 1, 1.5, prediabetes, type 2, gestational. All of them are united by this thing called insulin resistance. And truth be told, insulin resistance affects people that don't even have diabetes at all. It's just a basic biological mechanism. And I was experiencing it at the time, and most of the world actually experiences it today. So when I went to school back in 2007, I had this one question, which is, am I a freak of nature? Because the transition that I experienced from low carb to high carb, if you will, decreased my insulin usage. And that seems backwards. Is there something weird about me? Am I just like some kind of like genetic freak, or is there actually something interesting to learn here? And while I was at school, I unearthed a mountain of research about the fact that In fact, no, I'm not a freak. Well, I am a freak of nature for other things, but not when it comes to glucose metabolism. That in fact, what I had experienced is actually something that has been researched for over 100 years and is a basic biological mechanism that happens across the entire mammalian world. Okay, so here I am, what is it, 21 years after that transition. Okay, again, that was in 2003, and now it's 2024. So I've reduced my insulin usage by 40%, which is held constant basically the entire time. Now I eat more than 700 grams of carbohydrate per day. I inject about 25 units of insulin per day, which is an average, physiologically normal amount. And my A1C values are consistently in the non-diabetic range of 5.4 to 5.7%. So things have evolved in a fantastic way, and I'm super proud of that. If you haven't picked up the book Mastering Diabetes, I recommend doing that. This is a book that Robbie and I wrote together. It was published in 2020, and a lot of what we're going to talk about was actually published in this book, and a lot more. Okay, so traditional carbohydrate metabolism is basically a single variable relationship, which means that the story goes like this. It says, if you eat anything that contains carbohydrate, whether it's a banana or a white potato or a sweet potato or a bowl of rice or some black beans or some quinoa or some candy or some chips or some bread or some cereal, it does not matter. Anything that contains carbs, which are either whole carbs or refined carbs, will turn into this stuff called sugar. And that sugar is going to raise your blood sugar. And that increase in blood sugar is then going to make your pancreas manufacture more insulin. Or I just drew insulin in a vial here because that's how I inject it, and it's just easy to understand. So carbohydrates lead to sugar, sugar leads to blood sugar leads to insulin. That's a linear path from A to B to C. Okay. But if you actually look at biological mechanisms inside of human beings, they look nothing like that. Okay. Biological mechanisms are incredibly complex. They have a bunch of redundant mechanisms. They're completely nonlinear. And biological pathways interact with other biological pathways in many different ways and are incredibly complex, multifactorial systems. So trying to basically say A leads to B leads to C is just too simplistic. That's not how human beings were designed. That's not how nature was designed. And as a result of that, we cannot use these very, very, very simple arguments to try and rationalize what to put in our mouth. It just doesn't work. Okay. So what we have to do is take a little bit more of a rigorous scientific approach to understand that, okay, fine, carbohydrate does have a influence on how much insulin you require. Carbohydrate does have an influence on how much insulin is required. But guess what? So does fat. So do fatty acids of different chain lengths. So does protein. So does different amino acids. Okay. So does fiber. Okay. We have to take all of that into account because you can't just say is one variable that explains everything. You have to say, okay, well, there's multiple different things that all accumulate into creating a desired biological effect or an undesired biological effect. Okay. So that's kind of what I want to continue to think about as we move forward through this. All right. So in the world of diabetes, you basically have multiple different types of diabetes. You got the autoimmune diabetes on the top left, type 1 and 1.5. Then you have pre-diabetes and type 2, which is the focus of this presentation. And those are considered lifestyle diabetes. And then on the bottom, you have types of diabetes or blood glucose irregularity that affects females. So gestational diabetes is temporary diabetes while pregnant. And then polycystic ovarian syndrome is not a type of diabetes, but it's basically it's a condition that results in erratic blood glucose control. Okay, so all of them are connected by this thing called insulin resistance, because insulin resistance is the central factor that influences autoimmune and lifestyle and diabetes of females. Okay, so here's the question: what causes it? So in the chat box, there are a whole bunch of other really good. Let's see. Here we go. Okay. So a lot of you guys had answered that it's either fat or it's fat and sugar, some combination of thereof. And the answer is, you take a photo of the screen if you can. Okay. Insulin resistance is caused by the accumulation of excess saturated fat in tissues that are not designed to store large quantities of fat. Okay. So it's not just about all fat. It's not just about, it's not to say that we can't eat fat. It's about the fact that it's the accumulation of an excess quantity of particularly saturated fat and the storage of that saturated fat in tissues that are not designed to store large quantities of fat, AKA your liver and your muscle. Okay. That is literally what the game is about. Okay. So when I first went to graduate school and I was given the task of trying to induce insulin resistance in animals and then reverse insulin resistance, using either intermittent fasting or diet or exercise, I had to figure out, how do I create insulin resistance in animals? How do I create it inside of mice? And how do I create it inside of rats? And so I started reading everything that was available at the time. And my first thought was, well, it's all about sugar, right? It's all about sugar, sugar, sugar. It's all about carbohydrates. So let me just feed them a high glucose diet or a high sucrose diet or a high fructose diet, because that should probably do the trick. But no, 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 no. When you dig into the research, you actually find that it's all about lipid metabolism. Lipid basically just is a code word for fat. Okay. Lipid metabolism and the pathogenesis of insulin resistance. Okay. And the deeper I dug, it says how free fatty acids inhibit glucose utilization, how free fatty acids basically block glucose uptake in human skeletal muscle, the role of fatty acids in the pathogenesis of insulin resistance, the mechanism of free fatty acid induced insulin resistance in humans. This knowledge has been around for 100 years, literally since the 1920s. It's all over the place. So anybody you can just literally go to PubMed right now if you wanted to, and you could type in what causes insulin resistance, and you will see exactly what I'm seeing right here. It's very straightforward, right? But yet somehow the public has been sort of, the truth has been sort of like confused, and people now think it's all about carbs, 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 carbs. Okay. So like I mentioned earlier, insulin resistance is a function, or is a condition that affects your liver and your muscle. Those are the two target organs. All right. But in addition to that, it also affects your pancreas, and it can also affect your brain. Okay. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to talk about the two livers, the two tissues on your left, your muscle and your liver. Okay. Now, the last thing I'll say here about insulin resistance before we get into the mechanism is that insulin resistance, again, it affects all forms of diabetes, as you can see in the top right quadrant in orange, whether it's autoimmune, whether it's prediabetes and type 2, whether it's gestational. All of those forms of diabetes are affected by insulin resistance. But in addition to that, your cardiovascular metabolism on the bottom right, which is your dark blue, is also negatively impacted by insulin resistance. In other words, the more insulin resistant you become, the higher your risk for coronary artery disease, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, atherosclerosis, the hardening of blood vessels, high cholesterol. Okay. There's many forms of cancer that are actually directly linked with an increasing degree of insulin resistance. And then there's conditions like obesity, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and Alzheimer's disease that are all negatively impacted by increasing insulin resistance. And then there's all this stuff on the top left in red, which is neuropathy, blindness, kidney failure, retinopathy, erectile dysfunction. These are all different conditions that people with diabetes are basically just told, like, sorry, it's going to happen to you. It's just part of the disease process. So expect it at some point in the future, right? And this is why a lot of people with diabetes end up, going down the path of like nerve damage. They have to get limbs amputated. Sometimes their eyesight gets terrible. They go blind. Sometimes they get kidney failure, which can lead to a kidney transplant or dialysis. I mean, it can be a pretty treacherous route, but all of it is connected to insulin resistance. So you, as the individual, have the power. As long as you know that insulin resistance is literally the single most important health condition that you can positively impact every single moment of every single day, you then have the instruction manual for being able to reverse the insulin resistance pathology. And when you do that, then your severity of all of these chronic conditions go down simultaneously. Okay. That's why it is such an important mechanism. And that's why it is something that we all should become more knowledgeable about, because it's not about treating the symptoms of insulin resistance, which are all of the things on the outside. It's about treating the root cause of insulin resistance, which is in the middle. And when you do that, then all of a sudden the outside becomes much more manageable. Okay. So here's the sequence of events. Step one, lipids enter your blood. Okay. Here's what happens. You eat a cheeseburger. The cheeseburger contains a bun plus red meat plus cheese plus maybe some lettuce, pickles, onions. Okay. All of that in the middle. Now, this is a saturated fat and refined carbohydrate bomb. In other words, when you eat a hamburger, there's a significant amount of total fat that comes from both the red meat and the cheese together. But in particular, the type of meat, the type of fat that you're getting is saturated fat. Okay, now all of these fatty acid molecules, including the saturated fat, they're depicted in the little yellow circles. So those yellow circles, basically, the saturated fat and the rest of the fat basically become available for digestion inside of your small intestine. And inside of your small intestine, you have these billions, maybe even trillions of these little finger-like structures. They're called villi or microvilli. And what happens is that all of the nutrients inside of your small intestine kind of brush up against this border. And as soon as they get access to that border, these lymph structures can detect nutrients, and they selectively pull nutrients out of the inside of your small intestine, and they pull it into the blood or into your lymph system. So these lipids get pulled out of the inside of your small intestine, and they get put into your lymph. And as soon as they get inside of your lymph system, they travel for some period of time before they get transferred to your blood. And then as soon as they get put into your blood, they are then packaged into these particles called chylomicron particles. So those chylomicron particles are basically put into your blood. So within, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 2 hours after eating a fat-rich meal, the amount of chylomicrons inside of your blood increases. Okay. Now, at the same time, inside of your stomach, something else is happening. Okay. The lipids are going to actually slow down what's called your gastric emptying rate, which means that because there is fat inside of your food, your stomach senses this, and nerves inside of your small intestine experience. There are hormones that are secreted from your small intestine, then communicate to nerves that control how easily your stomach opens. And effectively what that means is that when you're consuming a fat-rich meal, it basically slows down the rate at which your stomach empties. So it almost causes like a little bit of a traffic jam inside of your stomach, and there's less food per unit time that's being dropped into your small intestine. And the reason that that's important is because the fat is the one that starts to get absorbed quickly, but then by absorbing fat quickly, it basically slows down the rate at which carbohydrate is absorbed. So fat effectively wins that battle. Okay, so if we zoom in a little bit more, inside of your blood now, you got thousands of different metabolites and thousands of different circulating hormones and immune cells and beyond. I've only pictured 3 of them on the screen here. You got insulin, fatty acids, and glucose. Insulin in green, fatty acids in yellow, and glucose in blue. So when you eat a fat-rich meal, the amount of fat in those chylomicron particles increases. So that's why I drew a significant amount of fatty acids right here in the center. So the fatty acid concentration increases. Glucose concentration is low because the only source of glucose from that meal was the bun, and there was a decent amount of it, but glucose hasn't really gotten into your blood yet because your gastric emptying rate has been slowed down. So the fat enters your blood first, and there's a little bit of insulin in circulation because there pretty much always is, which is depicted in green. So the fatty acids basically have to go somewhere because they're just using your blood as a highway or a conduit to get to somewhere else. So your liver and muscle are 2 places where fatty acids can accumulate, or where fatty acids can be taken up. So the fatty acids end up getting absorbed, truth be told, by 3 tissues. The first one is your adipose tissue, your fat tissue. Okay. But then the spillover, everything that doesn't get into your fat tissue ends up going inside of your liver and inside of your muscle. So within a few hours after eating a fat-rich meal, you end up with lipid that has entered your adipose tissue plus your liver plus your muscle. Okay. Now that's okay in small quantities, but when there's a significant amount of saturated fat, then all of a sudden we have a little bit of a problem, because glucose is also trying to get inside of your liver and muscle, because that's where glucose wants to enter as well, or that's where glucose wants to go. But glucose can't get inside of your liver and muscle unless it's accompanied by insulin. Okay, insulin is an escort that's required in order to get your liver and muscle to take glucose up. So insulin goes and knocks on the door, says, "Hey, knock, knock, there's glucose in the blood. Would you like to take it up right now?" And your liver and muscle, under normal circumstances, would say, "Sure, sounds like a plan. Like, give me some glucose." But because there's already a significant amount of fat that's accumulated inside of your liver and muscle, the liver and muscle basically say, no, I'm not paying attention to you right now because I got to deal with this stuff first. Like, there's a bunch of fatty acids that just entered literally like half an hour ago. I didn't ask for them. I gotta figure out what to do with this stuff first. I gotta oxidize this first. Therefore, I'm going to resist insulin. I'm going to reject insulin. I'm going to repel insulin, whatever word you want to use. Okay. This is insulin resistance. The liver and muscle literally create a self-defense mechanism to block their receptivity to insulin. They create a self-defense mechanism to block insulin from communicating with those two tissues because they're trying to find a way to block more stuff, more fuel, more energy from getting inside both of those tissues. So when insulin knocks on the door, says, hey, knock, knock, I got glucose inside of the blood. Would you like some? Both of those tissues say, no, 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 no. I'm sorry. I'm resisting you right now. I'm playing insulin resistance because I got to burn these fatty acids first. So glucose then gets trapped, and glucose is sitting in the blood being like, well, I'm supposed to go in the liver. I'm supposed to go in the muscle, but there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go because insulin can't get me in there. Insulin's trying, and insulin's not being effective. Therefore, glucose ends up pooling or increasing in its concentration. So you as the end user, maybe 2 hours later, 3 hours later, the next morning for breakfast, you're like, you know what? I'm going to eat a banana. So eat a banana. And the banana contains a small amount of carbohydrate, called 25 grams, 30 grams of carbohydrate. So you eat a banana. It's got carbohydrate energy. It gets cut into glucose molecules, and those glucose molecules then enter your blood. Again, glucose is trying to get inside of your liver and muscle. Insulin goes, knock, knock. There's a banana. There's glucose from a banana inside of the blood. Why don't you take it up right now? And liver and muscle are saying, nope, sorry. I'm still resisting you. I'm still resisting you because you put a lot of stuff into me earlier and I didn't ask for it. You put a lot of fatty acids inside of me earlier and I had no choice but to take it up. So let me first deal with that stuff and then I can take that glucose up. So glucose effectively ends up pooling inside of your blood and your glucose value goes up. So this is what people who eat a low carbohydrate diet experience left and right every single time they try and eat carbohydrate. They eat a potato, they eat a bowl of quinoa, they eat some raisins, whatever it is, a small amount of carbohydrate. And 2 hours later, they look at their blood glucose meter, their CGM, and they go, high glucose again. My number's in the 200s. So I told you bananas are bad for me. I told you potatoes are bad for me because they contain carbs. Carbs are bad for me. But in reality, it's not the carbohydrate that actually caused the problem. The carbohydrate is just an innocent bystander. The carbohydrate-rich food is trying to get broken down into glucose so the glucose can get inside of your liver and muscle, but it's actually the fatty acids that accumulated before you ate that glucose-rich food or that carbohydrate-rich food that caused a traffic jam. So effectively, you can think of insulin resistance as basically just literally being a traffic jam caused by the excess accumulation of fatty acids. It's just that simple. So in this situation, your pancreas goes, okay, hold on a second, let me fix this situation. If a little bit of insulin couldn't really get glucose out of the blood, maybe a lot of insulin can do it. So instead of secreting a few units of insulin, your pancreas goes, you know what, let me make 20% more, 30% more. I'm just going to make some more insulin and see what happens. So it makes a little bit more insulin, and then the little bit more insulin goes and knocks on the door of the liver and muscle and goes, hey, by the way, now you have to take up that glucose because there's a lot of me and I'm the boss. And so your liver and muscle at a certain point are like, well, I guess we don't have a choice anymore. And then they allow glucose to get inside. So in this scenario, you actually have 3 metabolites inside of your blood that are all circulating in excess quantities. Number 1, insulin, you're hyperinsulinemic. Number 2, fatty acids, hyperlipidemic. And number 3, glucose, hyperglycemic. Okay, hyperlipidemic, hyperglycemic, hyperinsulinemic. This right here is classic insulin resistance. And this is what doctors see and experience from a lot of their insulin resistant patients on a routine blood test. They'll come in and they'll do a blood test and they'll say, well, ma'am, looks like your cholesterol is high. Okay, when your cholesterol is high, effectively what that means is your LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, is high. And the LDL is a transport vehicle for cholesterol and fatty acids. So when your fatty acid intake goes up, especially saturated fat, well, guess what? Your cholesterol level goes up. So you look at your blood report and your doctor says, okay, well, your LDL cholesterol is pretty high. Your total cholesterol is pretty high. Again, both of those result from too much saturated fat. And then they say, well, your fasting insulin is also pretty high. And looks like your glucose is on the rise as well, huh? So your glucose on the rise, fasting insulin's getting higher and your cholesterol. All right, so here's the solution. I'm going to put you on a statin medication and I'm going to give you metformin. Okay. Statin medication should bring your cholesterol down and metformin should bring your glucose down. Oh, and by the way, you should also eat a low carb diet because you're probably eating too many carbs. Carbs are bad for you. And so as a result of that, you might be like, okay, well, too many carbs. I guess I'm going to subtract out the bread and the pastas and the sugar. And then what do? You go and eat more of the stuff that I was eating before: red meat, white meat, fish, chicken, peanut butter, turkey burgers, nuts, seeds, avocados. And you're like, okay, great. Well, I'm going to eat the low carb diet. Therefore, I'm going to eat more fat and protein rich foods. As soon as you do that, then guess what? You make this problem worse. This problem literally spins out of control. Okay. So the low carb diet is not the answer. A statin medication is usually not the answer. And metformin or a glucose lowering medication is usually not the answer. Okay. You see it on the screen right here because insulin resistance is a fatty acid traffic jam that results in hyperinsulinemia, hyperglycemia, and hyperlipidemia simultaneously. I hope that's making sense. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier that fatty acids can also get inside of your adipose tissue. Okay, so when that happens, here's what goes on. Fatty acids enter your adipose tissue. And that's a good thing because adipose tissue is the safe place to put fatty acids. That is exactly where it's supposed to go. It is a tissue that is designed to uptake fatty acids. That's where you want it to go. Great. Okay. But when fatty acids accumulate inside of your adipose tissue in excess, then you end up with a problem. Fatty acids end up accumulating. Your adipose tissue grows, aka you become larger. Maybe they refer to it as being your adiposity increases. You start to gain weight. And before you know it, now each cell within your adipose tissue is growing, and the amount of fat inside of each cell is also growing. Well, it turns out that your adipose tissue kind of acts like a balloon. At a certain point, it gets quite large, and then certain cells can start to break open because they're containing they just hold too much fat. And as soon as those cells break open, now you have a inflammatory problem because the extracellular material the intracellular material now spills into the extracellular fluid. And as a result of that, it signals for the tissue goes into an emergency state where it starts to manufacture emergency signals called cytokines. So these cytokines basically are alarm bells that the tissue sends out into the blood that says, I need help, please help me, because now there's an inflammatory state inside of the adipose tissue. So the cytokine's job is to basically travel through your blood. And then as soon as they get inside of your blood, they activate another cell type. And the next cell type that they activate is called a macrophage. So the macrophage are literally like little Pac-Men. You guys might remember that video game from back in the 80s and 90s, okay? Pac-Man comes along and it starts to just eat whatever it comes across, okay? But it's not going to eat, healthy living tissue. It's not going to eat immune cells in your blood, in your bloodstream that are beneficial. What it's going to do is it's going to go into your adipose tissue where the cytokine signal originated, and it's going to find the extracellular material, the stuff that doesn't need to be there. And the biological Pac-Men are going to come through and they're literally going to engulf that material and start to eat it up and then clear it from the tissue so that the tissue can return to a more normal state. This process right here is extremely inflammatory. The name of this condition is called macrophage infiltration. So this is called white adipose tissue macrophage infiltration. That's just a complicated way of saying macrophages are now invading or infiltrating your adipose tissue. And when they do this, that means that your adipose tissue is in a state of disarray. Okay. And when they do this, this becomes a huge problem because now there's excess lipid inside of your blood. And that excess lipid inside of your blood exacerbates the insulin resistance phenomenon that we were talking about earlier. So if you go in the literature, you'll see it's all over the place, okay? Free fatty acids inside of excess adipose tissue, okay? Chronic inflammation plays a crucial role in the development of obesity-related insulin resistance. Okay, it's a chronic inflammatory state that can spin out of control very quickly. And this tends to affect mainly people who are already obese or people who are on their way to developing obesity. Okay, so if that's a true statement for you, then this is something to be paying attention to, because effectively your liver and your muscle are already in an inflamed state because they're playing the insulin resistance game. But now, in addition to that, your adipose tissue is screaming out for help, saying, I have waste material inside of me. Can these macrophages please come clear this stuff out for me ASAP? Okay, so that's 3 tissues that are negatively impacted. Now, inside of your beta cells in your pancreas, this is a 4th tissue, can become negatively impacted quickly. Okay, all tissues contain these things called mitochondria. So mitochondria are, we refer to them as the powerhouses of the cell. They're little, they're factories where they're ovens. They're factories where things go to die. Okay, glucose goes to die. It goes to get oxidized, if you will, inside of the mitochondria. And as soon as it gets oxidized inside of the mitochondria, it can then yield ATP. Okay, fatty acids go to die, or basically get oxidized inside of the mitochondria. And when they do that, they create ATP. So ATP is this cellular form of energy that's required to power the cell. It's the electricity, if you will, or it's the fuel that enables cells to stay alive. Okay, all cells have to have an active ATP generation process happening inside of them at all times. And when that active ATP generation process is happening, then metabolic reactions can continue to happen. As soon as that ATP level falls to a dangerously low level, then the cell commits suicide and it kills itself, because there's no need to stay alive anymore. Okay, so when you eat a high-fat diet, the mitochondria inside of the beta cells themselves, the cells that are responsible for secreting insulin, get negatively impacted, because the beta cells have a very specific job, which is they sense glucose in the blood and then they manufacture insulin. Okay, so they go, oh, okay, not very much glucose. I don't need to make very much insulin. Everything's okay. And then the minute they start to sense that there's a rise in your glucose level, they go, hold on, make insulin go. And then they start to secrete insulin into the blood. Okay, so they're literally just responding to the amount of insulin inside, the amount of glucose in circulation. So when you eat something and your blood glucose begins to rise, that's a signal for the beta cells to say, now it's my turn, release insulin, manufacture insulin, go. And then it starts to bring your blood glucose back down again. So there's a normal variation inside of the blood glucose that is totally reasonable. That's totally normal physiological. And all of it is due to the fact that your beta cells are just responding to the amount of glucose in circulation. So how do they do that? Well, the mitochondria inside of those cells are the primary active sensing mechanism. The mitochondria are the ones that, as soon as the cell on the surface says, I sense glucose, that signal gets translated through the mitochondrial network, and the mitochondrial network has to do a whole bunch of things to do a very complicated calculation. And then all of a sudden it goes, make insulin, and it puts it into the blood immediately. All right. So these mitochondria are very important specifically for the beta cells. When you eat a high-fat diet and there's a significant amount of fatty acids that have accumulated on the cell surface, well, the high-fat diet and those fatty acids can actually generate a significant amount of free radicals. And those free radicals can be very dangerous because these are electronically unstable molecules. And free radicals are generated inside of mitochondria. And free radicals are an absolute disaster for cells, because when they are generated, they can damage DNA inside of the mitochondria and DNA inside of the nucleus. You don't want either of that. They can also damage proteins wherever those proteins exist. And this is called protein oxidation. And this is a huge problem. Okay. And they can also damage lipids. And lipids are either the lipids on the cell surface or lipids inside of the cell themselves. And it's called lipid peroxidation. So free radicals are very problematic. Okay. They damage DNA, they damage protein, they damage lipid. And when they do that, then they can put the cell in an altered state of metabolism that can either lead to cell death, or they could put it into an altered state where now the cell has to go recruit outside forces to try and help it survive. So under normal circumstances, an islet, or basically a beta cell inside of an islet, manufactures a physiological normal amount of insulin, as you can see on the screen here. When you cause the beta cells inside of your pancreas to manufacture excess insulin, which we talked about in a previous slide, when you're forcing your beta cells to have to make more insulin because your liver and muscle are not responding, then This is called hyperplasia or hyperplastic. What that means is that the actual size of the beta cells gets larger in the same way that the adipose tissue starts to grow and make you more overweight. Well, guess what? The beta cells themselves start to grow and get larger. They become hyperplastic. And then they start to manufacture excess insulin, which is hyperinsulinemia that we talked about earlier. So they're working in overdrive to be like, okay, make more insulin, make more insulin, make more insulin, make more insulin. And then as soon as they do that, they can do that for a finite period of time. Maybe they can do it for a year. Maybe they can do it for 2 years. But at a certain point, these cells lose their ability to manufacture more insulin because they have a finite capacity for manufacturing insulin. And when you work a beta cell too hard, eventually it'll kill itself. Okay. And I'm not trying to be dramatic, but this is actually what happens. So this is a state called apoptosis. And apoptosis is literally programmed cell death. It is beta cell suicide, where the mitochondrial network inside of the beta cells themselves says, you know what? We got a major problem inside of here. Okay. We're manufacturing way too much insulin right now. We're working way too hard. There's a lot of free radicals that are being formed all day long, every day. There's too much fatty acids that are present inside of the blood. I can't operate in this environment. And so as a result of that, they commit suicide. So when they commit suicide, this is a huge problem because this is a one-way street. As soon as they commit suicide now, these cells are non-recoverable. You cannot make more beta cells. To this, scientists are working on ways to manufacture more beta cells, but it's not a given. And so we want to try and avoid this as much as possible. Okay. And so again, if you travel into the literature, you'll see this says role of lipids in causing beta cell failure in type 2 diabetes and obesity. Okay. So they cause the pathogenesis of muscle insulin resistance, which leads to beta cell failure. Okay. Lipotoxicity, that's the name of this process. Lipotoxicity of beta cells causes fatty acid spillover. Huge, huge, huge problem. And this right here is what leads to a whole bunch of problems. Okay. If you think about it from the perspective of your beta cells, if you start to kill beta cells because they're working too hard, now you can't manufacture as much insulin. Your total insulin secretion goes down because some of that beta cell population is being selectively killed. And then as a result of that, some of these beta cells end up failing. Islets become dysfunctional. And then in your heart, it can cause backup problems, including myocardial insulin resistance, which basically just insulin resistance of your heart. In your liver, it can cause fatty liver disease and so on and so forth, right? So we don't want to travel down this path. This is a very, very, very dangerous path, and it's unfortunately a one-way street. So we want to do everything we can in our power to prevent against forcing your beta cells to have to work very hard. Okay, so if you go on the internet, you'll see people that say stuff like this. They say, look at me. My A1C is 4.7. I'm not even close to the prediabetes world. Okay. Prediabetes is 5.7 and above. Okay. My A1C is a full point underneath that. My glucose is flatline. It's never been lower. And it's between 80 and 90 all day, every day. I am winning. Prove to me that I'm doing something wrong. And they'll show you, they'll say, look, I'm eating a ketogenic diet. My glucose used to do this all day long, every day. It used to wiggle all over the place. And then I would go low, and then I would go high, and then I would do it again. And now I'm eating a ketogenic diet, and look what's happening, right? I am de facto healthier because my glucose variance is smaller. My time in range has gone up. And as a result of that, my glucose is now more stable. So true or false, I'm healthier. Okay. Go into the chat box and tell me, true or false? True or false? This gentleman on the screen right here is now healthier because he went from the top blood glucose profile to the bottom glucose profile. Okay, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 falses. Cheryl says false. Lisa says not sure. Good job, Lisa. Alejandra says true, but only temporarily. Okay, very good. Very good. Elizabeth says false. Okay, I'm going to say all of you are right. And if I had to answer the question myself, I would say I need more information. Okay, because in reality, what's happening is that if you're just looking at your blood glucose profile, right, and I didn't know anything about what this gentleman was actually putting into his body, I would say, well, yeah, of course you're getting healthier for sure. Okay, if I did not know that he was eating a ketogenic diet, I would say, okay, your glucose variance was pretty darn high to begin with. You were out of range a lot of the time, and now you started doing something, And now your glucose is much more stable. So fantastic. You're healthier, right? However, in order to get from point A to point B, he says now, oh no, I'm eating a ketogenic diet, which means I'm eating a lot of fat and a lot of protein and a very small amount of carbohydrate. And as soon as you say that, then all of a sudden it's like, boom, hold on a second, time out. What you're doing is you're actually suppressing your glucose variability because you're effectively eliminating carbohydrate from your diet, or you're strongly reducing carbohydrate from your diet, which is you're suppressing your glucose variability. And that's leading to this much more flatline profile. However, just like we talked about, your saturated fat intake has likely gone up significantly. And that right there is going to cause cardiovascular problems down the road. And it's going to increase the severity of insulin resistance in your liver and muscle. You will just not know. It will literally be silently hanging out in the background because you have subtracted carbohydrate from your diet. Okay. So low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets will reduce your A1C value for sure. And they'll make you think that you're reversing prediabetes and type 2, but they actually increase your level of insulin resistance in your muscle and in your liver. And when that happens, it is just a ticking time bomb before something else happens, and it could take some time. So that's why people who eat a low carbohydrate, high fat diet end up with a lot of short-term incredible improvements. Better glucose control, lower A1C, lose weight rapidly. That happens pretty much first out of anything. Then oftentimes, along with eating a ketogenic diet, they reduce their total cholesterol, increase their HDL, reduce their triglycerides, and reduce their blood pressure. And they're like, wow, holy crap, I feel a lot better. Things are moving in the right direction. But what they don't realize is that all of these short-term improvements, which are definitely moving in the right direction, have now become long-term medical liabilities, because underneath it all, the amount of insulin resistance, the degree of insulin resistance in their liver and muscle has increased. They're causing beta cell dysfunction at a cellular level. They're extremely carbohydrate intolerant, but they just won't know it because they're not going to eat any carbohydrate, significant carbohydrate foods to begin with. And they're increasing their risk for beta cell apoptosis. Their cholesterol, their LDL cholesterol is going to increase because that happens pretty much every single time. And they're likely to become hypertensive over the course of time. So you end up with these short-term improvements that then become long-term problems if you just fast forward long enough. All right, so then here's the next question. If what I just said is true, well, then what's your way out? How do you actually become insulin sensitive? Okay. Here's a perfect example. Joaquin, okay, living with prediabetes. He was diagnosed with prediabetes with an A1C value that was just under 6.0%. And his doctor tried to put him on metformin and said, hey, listen, you're going to need medication and you should eat a low carbohydrate diet. And he knew intuitively that it wasn't right. So he came to us and said, I think you guys have a better solution for me, which is diet related. Let me see if I can make some serious change. So we took him under our wing and we basically showed him the Mastering Diabetes method. And he ended up losing 35 pounds in 60 days without really even trying. He just that was a side effect, if you will. His fasting glucose came from 145 down to 95. His carbohydrate intake went through the roof. And this was very early in the process, after about 60 days. And it's now been multiple years since that time, fundamentally transformed human being from the inside out. Okay. Tammy's a very similar story, right? She ended up with type 2 diabetes. She had high cholesterol. Her A1C was 7.1%, and she was overweight. She was also prescribed metformin, 2,000 milligrams per day. So we taught her how to eat according to the green light, yellow light, red light protocol that I'll show you in a second. And she ended up within the first few months, call it 5 months, she ended up losing almost 40 pounds. Her A1C came into the non-diabetic range, fasting glucose non-diabetic, total cholesterol came down a little bit, LDL cholesterol came down a little bit, and her metformin use went down to 0. Right. And again, this was early in the process. She's been doing this for multiple years now and is a totally different human. All right. So for those of you that listen to Robbie, you would have heard him talk about specific foods. And even if you weren't there, that's totally fine. But the way that we can achieve those results and the way that you can achieve those results is simply by eating the foods you see on the screen here. Okay. We're talking about foods that are low in fat, plant-based, and whole food. They have to fulfill all 3 criteria. Okay. So we're looking for whole food ingredients whole food ingredients that come from the plant world and are low in fat in general. Okay. Does that mean that you have to be a vegan in order to make this work. Well, no, you don't have to be a vegan. You don't have to be a vegetarian, but the more of this type of stuff you can put in your mouth, the more of this material you can put in your mouth, the better your the lower your risk for insulin resistance in your liver and muscle will be, and the lower your chronic disease risk will be as a whole. So we put stuff into a green light, yellow light, red light category. Okay, categories. So first one, green light, fruits, starchy and non-starchy vegetables, legumes, green leafy vegetables, intact whole grains, and herbs and spices. So with these foods, you can pretty much eat them as much as you want or close to as much as you want. These foods have natural built-in mechanisms to make you full. And when they make you full, then they send a signal up to your brain that basically says, hey, don't eat any more food. And as a result of that, you can stop eating. So the beauty here is that when you eat these foods, it's very hard to overeat on these foods because they have so much fiber inside of them. And that fiber is a fullness and a satiety trigger that then prevents you from eating too much. The next category, yellow light foods, which can contain nuts, seeds, avocados, and coconuts. And these are, plant-based foods that tend to have a little bit more fat in them. Again, you can have them, but just in small quantities. And then we put pastas and breads in this category because those foods are just a little bit more processed. Again, a little bit goes a long way. And then in the red light category, these are foods that contain a lot of saturated fat, in particular dairy products, eggs, red and white meat, fish and shellfish, and oils of any kind. Okay, those are the saturated fat rich foods. And then refined sugars and pastries and breads are put in this category too because they can trigger insulin resistance specifically in your liver, and we're trying to get away from that altogether. Okay, so this is not about eating salads. You can eat salads if you want, but we're talking about foods that are dense. We're talking about potatoes with legumes in soups and tofu and fruit bowls and acai bowls and lentil salads and beyond. And if you like eating fruit, then join the club. I'm a huge fruit eater. Rob is a huge fruit eater. We have thousands of people who eat lots of fruit. And we find oftentimes that the people who eat the most fruit are the healthiest of all of the people. They have the best blood work for sure. Okay. Another example, Chris Hortel, type 1 diabetes, obese, hypertensive, high cholesterol, type 1 diabetes, lost 76 pounds in 11 months, cut his fasting glucose in half, A1C down by a full percent and then some. And he cut his insulin use by 35 units per day, which is about half of what he was using before. So similar to me, he was able to reduce his insulin use he did it by 50%. I did it by 43%, but he did it and he got a completely new lease on life because he just became insulin sensitive. And then he let the rest of the party unfold inside of his body. All right. So the step-by-step approach that we recommend looks like this. Okay. You could go cold turkey like me if you wanted to. I don't recommend it. Okay. And part of the reason I don't recommend it is because if you're medicated in particular and you just make a quick change, you could become over-medicated very quickly. And as a result of that, it could make your blood glucose go down significantly or your blood pressure go down significantly. And it could put you in the hospital. And I don't want that. So rather than just like making a drastic change and then also creating, a lot of emotional resistance to it and making it hard for yourself, do it slowly. Most of the time, nutrition is not an emergency. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to treat it like it's an emergency. Treat it like it's a long process that's going to take somewhere between 3 to 6 months to fully transition. And when you do it that way, your life becomes significantly easier. Okay, so we teach people how to change their breakfast in week 1. Literally, that's it. Just change your breakfast. And we give them a whole collection of different meals. They choose the ones that they like. They experiment around with them and they see what works for them. Got to figure out, what is it doing to my glucose? How much do I have to eat? Do I have to bring it to work? Do I have to eat it in the car? Am I eating it at home? Do I have to prepare it the night before? Figure out all the logistics, but just nail that one meal. Do that for about a week or 2 weeks. Then you move on to lunch. Do that for another week or 2 weeks. Then you move on to dinner. Do that for another week or 2 weeks. Then you move on to dessert. Do that for another week or 2 weeks. By the time you get here, you could either be 1 or 2 months into the process, right? 1 or 2 months to transition all 3 of your meals and then dessert if you eat dessert. And that gets you to a point where you're like, wow, okay, cool. I did this slowly. I figured out all of the mechanics of monitoring my blood glucose and my blood pressure. And I did it in a way where I didn't put myself at risk for either a hypotensive or a hypoglycemic event. Okay. The next thing we teach people is how to intermittent fast. So we haven't really touched too much on intermittent fasting here, but intermittent fasting is a very powerful technique that can help you become very insulin sensitive in a short period of time. It's a way to basically enter negative calorie balance. And by doing so, you're able to basically create more insulin sensitivity inside of your liver and muscles to help accelerate that process. Intermittent fasting is likely also to lead to more faster weight loss, and that could be a good thing in prediabetes and type 2 in general. So you do that for some period of time. You get used to intermittent fasting, usually for somewhere about we recommend a 16-8 approach, 16 hours of eating and 8 hours of fasting. And if you could do that and just get used to it on a daily basis, then you just literally are not hungry during those 16 hours, and it passes much faster than you might think. Then we teach people how to start integrating movement, into their daily routine. We recommend moving your body about at least 30 to 60 minutes per day. It does not have to be intense exercise, but get your heart rate up, get some resistance training in, get some cardiovascular training in, do a combination of the two of those, and really get your heart beating, because a low-fat plant-based whole food diet is powerful. It's an insulin sensitizer. Intermittent fasting is an insulin sensitizer number 2, insulin sensitizer number 3. And when you structure all 3 of those on top of each other, you become an absolute machine, and your blood glucose and cholesterol and blood pressure come down significantly and stay down for a long period of time. In addition to that, if you are injecting insulin, it's important to check in every moment of every day and make sure that you're backing off on your insulin and insulin use, because you're going to become very insulin sensitive in a short period of time. If you're not injecting insulin, then you won't have to worry about this purple bar. But if you are, then you either work with a doctor, work with a coach, or be on top of it yourself. Okay. So effectively, if I had to sort of draw general directional movements for each of these different things, I would say your fat intake is likely to come down significantly as you transition to a more plant-based diet using a low-fat foods that we talked about. Your carbohydrate intake is likely to increase significantly during the same time period. Your insulin use, whether you're injecting or the amount of insulin that's secreted by your pancreas, is likely to go down significantly. Your blood glucose is likely to do some strange things. It's likely to fall to begin with very quickly in the first couple of weeks. And then it might increase a little bit. It might get a little bit noisy. But overall, what we're looking for is as a downward trend. We want to move from like the top left down to the bottom right. And if it's a little noisy on the way down there, totally cool. It does not matter. All we're looking for is basically an overall downward trend so that you can reduce your total insulin use, reduce your fasting insulin concentration, reduce your post-meal insulin concentration. And when you can get there and you're down in this category on the right-hand side where your carbohydrate intake is high, fat content is low, and your insulin and blood glucose are nice and low, that right there leads to incredible health. Okay, so here's your sort of prescription. Number 1, eat somewhere between 70 to 80% carbohydrate from whole foods, and then somewhere between 10 and 15% from both fat and protein. So you can either eat like a 70-15-15 diet or an 80-10-10 diet, something like that. And if you're doing that way, then you're eating, carbohydrate rich, low fat, low protein foods that can transform your metabolism from the inside out. Also recommend sweating for 30 to 60 minutes per day, like we talked about. Intermittent fast when necessary. And then also join a community of other people who are also going through this process, because that just makes your life a whole bunch easier. And then that way you don't feel like you're doing this by yourself. So take a photo of the screen if you want. This is your homework assignment. It's very, very doable. And we're here to help out in any way, shape, or form that we can. So Michael, I will turn it back over to you. And thank you all for your attention.
All right. So that was a great presentation. That was probably the single best explanation of the mechanism of how one goes from healthy to diabetes that I've heard.
Awesome. Thank you.
So I really appreciate that that clarification. So, all right. So we're going to begin the Q&A. We've got about 50 plus minutes. If anyone would like to ask a question, we already have some hands. If anyone would like to ask a question of Cyrus, then you can do so by raising your hand in Zoom, and the instructions for how to do so are in chat. So real quickly, so I know this was more about type 2 diabetes and as opposed to type 1 diabetes, but can you explain what type 1 diabetes is, how it's different than type 2 diabetes, and then what are your thoughts on why people get type 1 diabetes?
Okay, great question. Great question. So type 1 diabetes is effectively an autoimmune attack of the beta cells in your pancreas. So like we talked about earlier, the beta cells in your pancreas are the only cell type that is capable of manufacturing insulin. In other words, there's no other type of cell in your pancreas or your liver or your kidney or your brain or your thyroid gland, nothing in your body can make insulin besides the beta cells. So they're a very, very important cell type, and you want to do everything you possibly can to preserve the ability of your beta cells to manufacture and secrete insulin. Okay. So if you get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, what often happens is that your glucose goes from being like, 100, 120, 130, 140 to all of a sudden like 300 or 400 or 500. It goes up very quickly. When I got diagnosed, it went up to 600, and you can feel it instantly. You become very thirsty, you lose weight, and it's not a very fun process to go through. So long story short, what causes that? Okay. The scientific world doesn't fully understand, what causes type 1 diabetes. I do believe that somewhere in the course of the next 10 to 20 years that we will solve type 1 diabetes as a research community, as a scientific community. Type 1 diabetes, in my professional opinion, will become eradicated. I think it will just disappear. Okay, but we're not there yet. There's a lot of research that's going into it, and researchers are fervently trying to figure out like what causes it, right? They've identified that there's many things that can increase your risk and the rate at which type 1 diabetes forms. Number one, introduction of cow's milk protein at a very young age. Okay, so human babies are basically supposed to breastfeed for approximately a year before they're transitioned over to eating solid food. Okay. And the reason for that is because the mother's responsible for passing immune cells to the baby and passing cells and passing a sort of nutritive effect so that the baby can get enough nutrition early on in their life and then eventually develop their immune system and go on and be a solo entity. But when you make the transition too quick and you transition a baby off of breast milk and put them onto formula, especially if it comes from cow's milk formula, then that can increase the risk for the development of type 1 diabetes into the future. It doesn't have to happen right away. It can happen years into the future, but that definitely increases the risk. Number two, there's actually a virus known as the Coxsackie virus. And when you get that Coxsackie virus, that can actually increase your risk for type 1 diabetes. There's a third one called MAP, and we wrote about this in the Mastering Diabetes book. MAP is a bacteria, Mycobacterium avium paratuberculosis. It's a mouthful. Long story short, it's in your food. It's in dairy products. It's in meat in the grocery store. And when you ingest MAP, that can also significantly increase your risk for developing type 1 diabetes. Okay. Those are three potential causes. It's not black or white. There's a whole bunch of other things that could come into play as well. But those are things that can cause this autoimmune attack. When the autoimmune attack happens, effectively, the beta cells inside of your pancreas get attacked by your own immune system. And your own immune system basically targets them for destruction, kills them. And then before you know it, all of a sudden you're like, great, I don't make insulin anymore. Now I have to inject insulin from the outside world using pharmaceutical meds.
So given that two of the three ways that we think that people may become more susceptible to getting type 1 diabetes are through animal products, do we find that people who are raised whole food plant-based and are breastfed for longer than a year have a significantly lower rate of type 1 diabetes?
That is a great question. That's a great question. I don't know if I can answer that with full confidence. I would say that I know for a fact that when there's a transition specifically to cow's milk before the age of 1, then there's a significantly increased risk. Does that mean that somebody who eats animal products at a young age is also going to have an increased risk? I don't think I could jump to that conclusion because I think that that's not known. But the introduction of cow's milk, like Dr. Greger actually on his website has some pretty fascinating videos about what the actual mechanism is when it comes to cow's milk, because there's a particular form of casein that can do this. And those might be worth exploring, but it's usually just specifically about the milk and the transition to milk from mom to cow at a young age.
And just the last question on type 1, are people with type 1 more or less or the same susceptible to getting type 2 diabetes?
Oh, good question. Okay. So I like to think of type 2 diabetes as basically just being a constellation of symptoms. Okay. So type 2 diabetes, even though it's technically considered a different type of diabetes, is just what we described: hyperinsulinemia, hyperglycemia, and hyperlipidemia simultaneously. Okay. So if you are living with type 1 diabetes, you can also get to that state as well. You can also get to that state where your cholesterol is high, your glucose is high, and you're injecting a lot of insulin because you are eating a low carbohydrate diet and you are trying to keep your glucose low, but it's not working. So that's what happened to me in the first year. So effectively, you could think of me and many people who are living with type 1 diabetes as being classified as type 1, but living with the symptomology of type 2. Right. So I refer to those people as having double diabetes, because that's exactly what it is. And there's actually, it's written about in the research that there are people who have insulin resistance plus type 1 diabetes, and that right there is a metabolic disaster for the beta cells as well.
So I grew up the child of somebody who had diabetes, and the whole, and my father had always eaten these dietetic cookies that were low in sugar. And to this day, I persist that the idea is sugar. I think you kind of spoke a little bit about that. Why does conventional medicine seem to be stuck on this sugar is the cause of diabetes paradigm?
Because it's a really easy explanation. It's a really simple explanation that is true from their perspective. So let's put it this way. Let me go back to sharing my screen, because you bring up actually a very good question. And I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about this. Okay. Remember this slide that I shared here before, right? It says traditional carbohydrate metabolism is a single variable relationship. Okay. Humans like to think in linear mechanisms. Things are always easier to understand when A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. If you can just think linearly, it just makes things a lot simpler. Okay. Rather than trying to think like this. This is very complex, and it's just like, it's too complicated, and people, this can't be true. It's too complicated, right? So what happens is that, picture the scene. Imagine that you are already living with type 2 diabetes, or you are already living with prediabetes, and that is the state at which you become aware that there's a problem. Okay. If your glucose is already elevated a little bit, and you are already in a hyperinsulinemic state, and you are already a little bit overweight, and then in that environment, I start to put more carbohydrate energy into your body, I start to give you more bananas or more potatoes or more white rice, you will observe your glucose go up. And then that will fuel the premise that carbohydrates are bad for you, because every time you do it, you're like, wow, my glucose is going up. I ate a potato and now my glucose is higher. The potato is the bad guy, right? But what people don't recognize is that the carbohydrate in this scenario is not the actual cause of high blood glucose. It's the metabolic state in which you were in preceding the consumption of the potato, which caused a high blood glucose. So you have to go backwards in time in order to understand why the potato is causing you a high blood glucose value. And that process is hard for people to do. So instead of doing that, they just go, oh, well, we can clearly see it. All you got to do is just check your blood glucose, and then boom, all of a sudden it goes high. That's a problem. Don't eat potatoes. You see what I'm saying?
Sure. And I can understand the layperson with a simplistic understanding of the mechanism of what causes diabetes. I'm a little surprised that the medical community has still hung on to onto the older paradigm, because they should have a more sophisticated understanding of it. Do you see that the medical community is coming around to this deeper, more complex understanding of what seems to be the true mechanism of the cause of diabetes?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of doctors who are waking up to this for sure. Those doctors tend to be the doctors that are sort of like more, I don't know, for the most part, more plant focused. It's almost like there's two different populations of doctors. There's two different, when doctors decide to educate themselves outside of their traditional medical practice, they go into one of two worlds. They either go into the plant-based world, or they go into the functional medicine world. Okay. And so what I've observed is that the people who go into the functional medicine world end up going down the paleo, keto, carnivore route. And then they are educated by those experts. And then they say, oh, okay, meat is good for you. Plants are bad for you. Plants contain anti-nutrients, don't eat plants, right? That's the one direction. And then the other direction is like, wait a minute, hold on a second. Plants are actually very good for you. Try and reduce your intake of meat and dairy products altogether, and that's going to make you healthier, right? So I think doctors as a whole are waking up to the fact that pharmaceutical medications are not the answer. But unfortunately, what I see is that the majority of doctors go down the functional medicine route. It's like, I don't really know the numbers, but let's just say it's like 7 out of 10 go down the functional medicine route and 3 out of 10 go down the plant-based route. And the ones that go down the plant-based route are the ones that vibe with this description. And the one that go down the functional medicine route vibe with a completely different description.
What's the difference between functional medicine and integrative medicine?
I've been asking myself the question, Pat, for a long time, and I ask a lot of doctors, and a lot of doctors are like, I don't know. Functional medicine has a very vague definition associated with it. And I have a difficult time really understanding what that means myself, but it's somewhere along the lines of like, we're going to use food as medicine, and we're going to use other modalities outside of pharmaceutical medication to see if we can find a way to heal you, right? It could be breath work. It could be intermittent fasting. It could be exercise. And these are all things that even the plant-based world believes in. But the term functional medicine has just been, it's almost like it's like a rebranded term to describe a different type of doctor. And my observation is that people who are on that route tend to fall into the, keto carnivore route, thinking that that's the right way to go. And they have an alternate explanation of what causes insulin resistance.
All right, another definition question. What is the difference between autophagy and apoptosis?
Yeah, good question. Okay. So autophagy is basically a cellular recycling program. So let's just make sure we're on the same page. Okay. What I talked about earlier is apoptosis. It's spelled apoptosis. So you read it and you say it looks like it says apoptosis, but it's actually apoptosis. And apoptosis is basically programmed cell death. So it's cell death that occurs as a result of a dysfunctional metabolic state. Okay, so if there is a cell that is in a problematic state, the cell could be, in an inflamed state. It could be secreting cytokines. It could be inside of a metastatic tumor. It could be a beta cell that's under attack from the pancreas. It could be any number of mechanisms. Those cells end up going through a programmed cell death where they basically kill themselves. Okay, autophagy is slightly different. Autophagy is a cellular recycling program where the cells that are in a dysfunctional state are intentionally cleared and put into the trash can so that they can give rise to healthier cells in the vicinity. Okay, so do cells that are the cells that are cleared by the autophagy state actually apoptotic? I don't know if I know the answer to that question, but you can think of it as that, let's put it this way. Even if the cells that were cleared in the autophagy process did undergo apoptosis, the apoptosis that I was referring to is the apoptosis of a healthy cell that shouldn't be killing itself. Okay, so I refer to apoptosis as basically being like a distress signal, but autophagy is actually the clearance of cells that are either like in a dysfunctional state that leads to the betterment or the improvement of the organism as a whole.
Okay, so based on the way that you described it, apoptosis should be looked at as kind of when things aren't going properly in your body, and autophagy when they are. So for example, if you're going through a fast, you may go through autophagy and clear these cells that need to be cleared out. And that's a healthy mechanism. And apoptosis in this context that you were talking about is when there's a disease state basically, and something these cells are basically dying unnecessarily. They should have been healthy cells and live, but because there's a problem, they're dying.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You said it well.
All right, thank you. And with keto diet and people becoming severely insulin resistant because they're reinforcing that mechanism with their diet in probably the most severe way, right? By eating such high fat. How does somebody who's been on a keto diet for so long and built up such insulin resistance come off of that diet safely without spiking the sugar up the wazoo? Or is that even possible?
Amazing. Yep. Here's the answer. The answer is right here. The answer is slowly. Because if you make the change too quickly, then what'll happen is that your glucose will go high, and then you'll give up after a week or 2 weeks, being like, oh my, this isn't working. So rather than doing that, the approach is to make the change slowly. Like I said, if you're going to change your diet, I recommend changing your diet over the course of like 1 to 2 months, and start by subtracting fat-rich foods first, and then increasing carbohydrate intake later. And if you do it that way, then you can at least slow down or reduce the amount of insulin resistance that's present inside of your liver and muscle to begin with, which then increases your carbohydrate tolerance, enabling you to eat more carbohydrate over the course of time.
But with naming specific foods, what foods would someone eat in that middle state where you're getting rid of the high fat foods and you're not going for the high carbohydrate foods?
Great question. Okay, so here's what I would say. We're going to be trying to subtract these foods over here on the right hand side, like we talked about, the red foods, and you can eat some yellow foods, but try and minimize those. What we're trying to figure out here is like, what am I going to eat at first in the green light category, and then how am I going to change that over the course of time? So what I would recommend doing is moving towards non-starchy vegetables. Those are things like cauliflower and tomatoes and cucumbers and broccoli and Brussels sprouts. Okay, these are all vegetables that don't contain a significant amount of starch. Eat a significant amount of those. Eat a lot of beans, lentils, and peas, because these are basically legumes that have carbohydrate, but it is a very slow releasing form of carbohydrate. And maximize your green leafy vegetable intake. So if you could just sort of focus on these three right in the middle, then what that'll enable you to do is eat a slow acting form of carbohydrate and a lot of other, non-starchy and green leafy vegetable material. And then after you do that for the, at least a 7-day period, maybe even 7 to 14 days, then you start to increase your intake of starchy vegetables and fruits in particular. And then when you do that, you will start to find that your ability to metabolize those starchy vegetables and fruits goes up significantly, because you've already subtracted out a significant amount of fat from the right-hand side.
So we had Gabriel Cousens on earlier today. I don't know if you are familiar with his work.
Yep.
Okay. And he's not a big fan of fruit. And he actually did a talk on diabetes today. And he compared his protocol with Dr. Neil Bernard's, and he's a big fan of Dr. Neil Bernard's. He showed the numbers, like the blood sugar levels of somebody on his diet versus the diet that Dr. Neil Bernard recommends. And according to him, it's the numbers are quite stark with regard to how far down he's been able to get the blood sugar. And he said that fruit, and having a low amount of fruit is something that he highly recommends, and is a major reason why he sees the numbers that he sees with regard to blood sugar. What are your thoughts on that? And the numbers for Dr. Neil Bernard's were good and in the healthy range. He just saw a more drastic and I guess perhaps healthier, or maybe it's just you're getting these really great numbers, but maybe it doesn't confer any real life benefit. I don't know. Right. What are your thoughts on Dr. Cousens' protocol and his purported outcomes?
Is specifically when he was comparing Dr. Barnard's research versus his, was this on people with prediabetes in type 2 or in type 1?
I can pull up the slide in a minute if you give me a minute to scroll back.
Sure. I'm assuming it was in prediabetes in type 2 because the majority of Barnard's research has actually been there.
Yeah, well, I know that it was type 2. It definitely wasn't type 1.
Okay, cool. Okay, perfect. Yeah. So you're right. Again, so Gabriel Cousens, mad respect for him, fantastic individual, great guy. And he's right. Like if you play the carbohydrate avoidance game, which is basically a high fat intake, he's just doing a high fat intake from a completely plant-based approach. If you play that game, you're going to get better blood glucose values. You will get a flat line blood glucose response. And the question really becomes, is a flat line blood glucose response better than a slightly, what's the word I'm looking for? Is a flatline blood glucose response better than having some variation in your blood glucose on a daily basis? in terms of long-term health outcomes, right? Because you could look at it on a piece of paper and say, okay, flat is better, but then if it doesn't necessarily translate to any improvement in metabolic health down the road, then what's the point? Okay. So that's what I would say, number one. Secondarily, I think I always go back to the research. There's research demonstrating what happens to people who are who are non-diabetic individuals, and you take a look at their blood glucose variance on a daily basis. And what you will see is that non-diabetic individuals have a blood glucose variance from about 70 milligrams per deciliter all the way up to 153 per day. So there's a fluctuation that kind of goes up and down and up and down, and that is considered totally normal physiology. And so if that's what people who are non-diabetic at a very low risk for disease are doing, and that's considered normal mammalian physiology, then why would we try and invent a system that gets you flatter than that, and thinking that it's going to have a better long-term health outcome? Okay, I would love to see, if we could fast forward 20 years into the future, I would love to see head-to-head if like the Mastering Diabetes approach and Dr. Gabriel Cousens' approach ended up with two distinctly different health outcomes, or Dr. Barnard versus Dr. Cousens. I'd love to see if there's two distinctly different health outcomes. We just don't have that information at this point. And I don't think there's enough time to determine whether or not that's true. But I don't think that there's enough scientific evidence to conclude that having a completely flat blood glucose is going to lead to better health outcomes.
And is there a possibility that you run into the risk of what you see with the keto diet, where your blood sugar looks great, but you might actually be making yourself more insulin resistant?
Yeah, exactly right. Because what Gabriel Cousens is doing, again, is he's teaching people how to eat a high-fat, raw, high-fat diet, basic and plant-based. And what that means is that people are eating themselves into insulin resistance. They are just doing it using plant-based food. So they're eating a much more nutrient-dense collection of foods, but they are still in an insulin-resistant state as far as their liver and muscle are concerned.
Can you see the screen? This is the slide I was referring to. Just real quickly, you can if there's anything new on here.
Okay, so he's got ADA versus Dr. Cousens versus Barnard. So he basically says weight loss 9, 18, 12, medication 26, 97, 46. Okay. I mean, his numbers are fantastic. Don't get me wrong. I'd have to study this in a little bit more detail in order to like fully understand it, but
And I mean, are obviously great numbers. As Pan Popper would point out, that these good looking tests does not necessarily mean health, and you could end up. And I'm not saying this about what he's doing, but you could end up with when you're looking at making all your numbers perfect, you can be doing things that harm yourself, and in the worst case scenario, you can end up dead with really beautiful blood work. Right?
Yeah, well said. Well said.
So, all right. So I am going to put it out to the audience to ask a few questions here. So Anna Tina, go ahead, state where you're from and ask your question.
Hi, I'm from New York. Hi, Cyrus.
How you doing? How you doing?
Learning from you so much. You're the best teacher in the world.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I have an 88-year-old friend who was he was pre-diabetic and on medication for about 15 years. He was on Januvia, which is sitagliptin.
Right.
Till about 2018, where I was able to persuade him, possibly with the book of Mastering Diabetes, that he changed his diet. And within 11 days, he got jittery, he got hypoglycemic symptoms. And 2018, he stopped all meats and butters. And then a little later, his blood sugar was around 120s. And he further stopped the oils and Parmesan cheese, and he's totally eating your diet, mostly 50% the green and 50% the yellow foods. However, over the years, his fasting blood sugar has been climbing from the 120s to the 140s, sometimes 150s fasting blood sugar. We had gotten him, thanks to your book, to do a C-peptide. He's in France.
Good.
Doctors were a little spoofed. And his C-peptide fasting was 2, went up to 2.5 postprandial. But he's saying, well, now it's my new normal, 140. I feel fine on 140. What advice would you give him?
Okay, so his glucose is climbing. His C-peptide, he took a C-peptide measurement recently and got a 2.0. Does he exercise on a daily basis?
He's a martial arts teacher, still at his age, and
Okay.
woodworker. So he's while he's not exercising like at the gym, he's physically active, lifting heavy stuff.
Okay. Let's I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but cardiovascular exercise is incredibly important. So oftentimes when I tell people to become active, they go, okay, cool, sweet. I go to the gym. I work out at the gym and they lift heavy objects, which is awesome. No problem with that. But what I think people underestimate is the power of accelerating your heartbeat. Okay. So if he can, maybe you can help dig this information up, or maybe you can tell him this. If he can get his heartbeat, basically his heart rate up to what's considered like zone 3 for him, which is basically going to be between 60 to 70% of max heart rate. If he can get up into the zone 3 level for 30 minutes per day, 3 days a week, watch as his fasting glucose comes way down. He may, if he's already doing that, awesome.
He's not getting there because he has shortness of breath. He has one of his heart valves is kind of calcified.
Okay.
He gets even walking fast. He would like to do more, but he gets short of breath.
Okay.
For him to push, it's
ill-advised. Does he?
And he has AFib.
He has AFib. Okay, got it. Now,
untreated doesn't really bother him.
What about his? Is he overweight?
No.
Normal weight.
Well, he lost a lot of weight going totally vegan, non-fat, no salt. What is the advice? Should I tell him it's okay? Okay, you feel fine on 140. I'm not going to bother you. I'm not going to take away the cashew nuts or whatever the last yellow foods. He likes bread.
Yeah. Okay. So then the last thing that I would do is I would use a food logging app called Chronometer. Chrono meter. We use that all the time. Teach him how to use Chronometer, have him log his food intake, and try and figure out how many total grams of fat and protein and carbohydrate he's eating per day. Okay. Ultimately, what I think he might be doing is he might be over consuming on his fat intake without knowing it. Our general target recommendation is to get somewhere around 30 grams of fat per day, because that seems to be a threshold above which insulin resistance can start to climb. So if he's measures his total food intake and he's at 52 grams of fat per day, bring it down and watch as his fasting glucose also comes down.
I guess I'll have to do that for him. He gets I don't want to do more things. I'm already changed all of this stuff, and this is just the way it is now for me.
Yeah, I got you.
I'm not going to do Chronometer. I don't want to like become a medical, patient of myself. But I'll do it for him. I'll try.
Yeah, try helping him out with that, and then see, just do it, just enter it with curiosity and see what numbers result, because if he's significantly above 30, then that could be a very simple change to make.
Yeah. What can I tell him would be the risk of being at fasting sugar of 140 on a regular basis?
What's the risk?
He starts feeling hypoglycemic when he's on 115 or something like that.
Yeah. So effectively, oftentimes when you have a high blood glucose on a sort of daily basis, when your blood glucose comes down below that value, you can get what's called phantom hypoglycemia, which means that your brain thinks that you're actually hypoglycemic when you're not.
Gotcha.
Right. So if he'll adjust over the course of time, and he'll stop feeling that. But have him come down slowly over the course of time, and just try.
The negative promoters of what's the risk if he stays on 140?
Yeah, so we don't want him to stay on 140 because that can lead to it can lead to cardiovascular issues. It can lead to atherosclerotic plaques building up over the course of time. It can
Okay,
lead-
the regular things that any
Yeah.
other. Okay.
Exactly. Increased risk for nerve damage. Like, we don't want to go down that route. Increased risk for, Alzheimer's and dementia in his brain over the course of time.
You would not like that. Thank
Yeah.
you, Cyrus.
For sure,
Yeah.
for sure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hearing that, and I have no idea what's going on in this guy's situation, but it makes me think of people's perception of what they eat and perhaps what they share with others, what they're actually eating. If somebody deviates from their supposedly perfect diet and they feel guilty about it themselves, they may end up not sharing that with somebody else. Say, oh no, I did great and I've done perfect. How do you find people's psychological barriers for people, balancing trying to be good with their tendency to fall back into old habits or to be in denial of what they're actually consuming?
So repeat the question one more time.
How do you find do you find that sometimes people are in denial of what they're actually consuming, essentially?
Yeah. Most of the time people are in denial about what they're consuming. Yes. That's why we teach people how to, use a food log, because if you food log honestly, then the food log doesn't lie. Right. And so it's very easy to think that you're eating one way and then tell yourself a story that it's actually the truth, but in reality it's not. I mean, I remember when I made my diet change, I had to log my food intake, for the better part of a week. I was shocked. At what was on that piece of paper. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh God, that's what I'm doing to myself? That doesn't make any sense. And then I made the transition and all of a sudden it became truth. So the thing is that nutrition is very emotional, very charged subject, right? And, that's okay. You're allowed to be, emotional about what you eat, because a lot of what we've eaten over the course of time is like, traditions and like things that make you feel good. But if you're really in this because you want to significantly improve your health, then it's important to also try and recognize that when your emotions bubble up, talk to your emotions and recognize that that's emotional, but also try and make dietary change as data driven as possible. And when you can do that, then the numbers don't lie and the numbers will move you in the direction that you want to go.
Great. All right. So next question is coming from Stephen V. Please go ahead and ask your question, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Cyrus. I got a BMI of 22. My fasting glucose is 90. My triglycerides are 100. And my fasting insulin is 9. How big of a deal is the 9?
How big of a deal is the 9? That's a good question. I would say it's not that big of a deal. Read me the numbers one more
time. 90 on the fasting glucose, BMI 22, triglycerides 100.
Triglycerides 100. Okay. Do you have any previous measurements prior to that?
That's the first insulin measurement I ever took. Glucose has been in the 80s, 85 to 90. Triglycerides are 100 to 150. And BMI has been 22 for quite a while, 22, 23, like that.
Okay. And how do you eat?
And I'm whole foods plant-based. I use walnuts. I'll use flax seeds. A little bit of oil creeps in, if I buy some food, but it's pretty clean. Oatmeal, beans, sweet potatoes, salads, pretty clean. Not pristine, but pretty good.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a calculation called the HOMA-IR calculation, which is basically a mathematical formula that you can put your fasting glucose and your fasting insulin into, and then it'll spit back a number at you. And effectively, you want the HOMA-IR number to be low, and the lower the number, the less insulin resistance there is in the fasting state. So I don't have the actual equation in front of me here at this very moment, but I would recommend putting all of your values into that calculator and seeing what the number, what it spits back at you. Effectively, with a fasting insulin of 9, that means that you're basically in a hyperinsulinemic state in the fasted state. And the reason that that's likely happening is because there's a decent amount of insulin resistance inside of your liver and muscle that is still hopefully in the process of being cleared. And so your pancreas is basically having to work a little bit harder than it normally should in order to manufacture excess insulin to try and get glucose into your liver and muscle, right? So I would say on a scale of like 1 to 10, how big of a deal is it? I'd put it at like a 5 or a 6, to be perfectly honest. It's not alarming. The fact that your glucose is in the normal range is good. But we don't want your glucose to be in a normal range when you're forcing your pancreas to have to work, in overdrive for long periods of time.
Okay.
All right, great. Thank you. And next question is coming from Laura M. Laura. Oh, close to that. Go ahead, Laura. Hold on. There we go.
Hello.
Hello, Laura.
Hi. I'm from Arizona. Thank you, Cyrus, for an awesome presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is, I'm a raw, low-fat, thin vegan for a number of years now, and my fasting, and I take my blood sugar reading in the morning, and every day it's like 110, 118, and I stop eating by 6 p.m. and then I take it like at 7:30 a.m.
Mhm.
and I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong.
Okay. Do
Like
you
I said,
exercise?
oh, go ahead.
Are you exercising on a daily basis?
Well, yeah, I was listening to that previous caller, and I clean areas for a living, and so it's fast, and I do it all quickly, but it's like short, fast bursts where my heart rate goes up, but I'm not doing sustained 30 minutes 3 times a week like you were saying.
Okay. That's my recommendation. So, I focus a lot of my education on teaching people what foods to eat in order to reverse insulin resistance. But the truth is that exercise is a very, very, very powerful tool. And I think a lot of people focus a lot on diet, which is great, but they neglect just how much power cardiovascular exercise has on lowering blood glucose. So what my recommendation to you, or to anybody else who's listening to this, who's in a similar position where your glucose is a little bit higher, even though you're taking all the right dietary steps, is good work on the diet, but we now have to get to a point where you are exercising more rigorously. Okay. And again, cardiovascular exercise in particular has a very, very powerful glucose lowering effect. And if you can get to a point where you're exercising, like I said, 3 times a week, doing, primarily cardiovascular exercise where you're in the zone 3, 67% of your target heart rate, you will see the effect, and you will see the effect very quickly. And it'll definitely lower your fasting glucose. And it could be literally just that simple.
Okay, I'll see if I can do that. But one problem is I don't really have a lot of extra energy because I'm doing the house cleaning, so many days a week, and I feel like I need to just rest, and so I don't feel like I have excess energy to really do aerobics.
Okay, let me challenge you with that. When you perform exercise the way that I'm suggesting, your overall energy level will actually go up. It's counterintuitive. People who exercise frequently often have a lot more energy for the rest of the day. And I know it sounds backwards, but if you could think about it from that perspective, you're not using up the remainder of the energy that you have for the day to exercise. You are using exercise to increase the amount of energy that you have for everything else. Think about it from that perspective.
Right. So we're going to go to the next caller, or the next person. It'll be Willa D. And we just have about 3 or so more minutes left. So we're going to be ending this at 6:50 Eastern time for everybody, just so you guys know. So Willa, go ahead and ask your question. Willa D. All right, going to Joe W. Joe, and ask your question.
Thanks. Great job, Cyrus. I heard Doug Graham talk years ago. You're a great student. So
Thank you.
question, cooked versus raw, especially tomatoes, beans. People still debate cooked versus raw.
Yeah. So probably can't eat beans in the raw state. Wouldn't recommend it. I used to be a raw foodist for 14 years. Huge supporter of raw food eating. I switched over to eating more cooked foods because I had a call with Dr. Furman, and I actually spoke with him at length about the benefits of eating, more cooked foods. And I found out that there's actually some nutrients that I could be missing. And also, I wasn't able to eat any legumes, which have a very serious protective effect on not only, improving glucose metabolism, but also on, longevity in the long term. So I switched over to eating raw plus cooked food. And I've become a believer in, the power of having cooked vegetables in your diet as well. So it's totally up to you. It's a personal choice, but I feel like this is one of those things, like we were talking about earlier. It's one of those things that we could debate this ad nauseum for years.
So
right?
which cooked have you put back in?
So I put back in, like steamed vegetables, whether they're non-starchy vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, zucchini, things like that. Then I also put back in all legumes, beans, peas, and lentils. And then I also put back in potatoes.
Okay, great. Great to
Yep.
hear.
Yeah, so go
Thank
for it. I mean, yeah, I think that this debate is something that may never be solved, but do what feels right for you.
And to that point, well, first of all, what are your thoughts on sprouted beans, which Brian Clemente is a proponent of?
Yeah, huge fan. Doug Evans is a huge fan of that too. Sprouted anything is a far superior form of nutrition. By all means, if you can sprout and you can get it in sprouted state, by all means do it.
So we just have a couple of minutes left. So on this debate of the minutia, do you find that people, there's a danger of all these little tiny differences that people get lost in when they're trying to navigate how to be healthy, when the consensus is really what we should be focusing on, like a whole food plant-based diet, whether it is 100% raw or 80%, 80% raw, or, a mix of the two, or, whether or not you're getting this exact nutrient or you should add that exact thing in what are your thoughts on that and it muddling up the overall message for health?
100%. I get very frustrated with the sort of arguing over minutia because it just detracts from the overall picture, right? It's like we're missing the forest for the trees, right? What we're trying to do is move in the direction of eating a plant-strong diet, right? And no two health experts will ever fully agree with one another because both health experts have a different educational background, they have different personal experience, and they're different humans, right? So, someone like, what's a perfect example? Dr. Will Bolsowitz, him and I are fantastic friends. We call each other all the time. We're good buddies with each other. And yet, despite that, sometimes he'll have one view of sourdough bread that might be slightly different than my view on sourdough bread, but that doesn't mean that he's a bad person. I don't espouse his philosophy. It just means that we have different experiences and different knowledge bases, right? Same thing. Dr. Furman might say one thing. I might say something different. Gabriel Cousins might say one thing, and, Robbie might say something different. So the fact of the matter is, like, what we're trying to do as a community is basically move towards a plant-stronger diet. So let's all do that. And then all the tiny little minutia about what about vitamin K2 here, and what about sprouts here, and what about this? Let's tackle those on an individual basis, but we can't really let that get in the way of moving in this direction and really turning this into a sustainable lifestyle. That is the most important thing that you can do. And that's the way that we should all think.
All right. Well, I think that's a great way to end. Just one quick micro question. Someone's asking for the food log that you recommended.
Oh yeah. It's called Chronometer, Chronometer.
All right. And well, so I want to thank you. You're our last speaker, so we'll stay on after Cyrus goes. But so I want to thank you again. That was a really great and in-depth and easy to understand explanation of how we end up with diabetes. So I definitely took a lot of notes on that. So thank you. And if we can unmute the audience so they can share their appreciation with Cyrus as well.
The summers are
Great
great
presentation.
presentation.
And Michael.
Cyrus.
Good heart.
Thank you, guys.
Wow.
Tesla.